From Friday the 6th of June to Sunday the 8th of June 2014, the Green Foundation Ireland hosted a conference, a summer school, on the theme of greening the EU in the context of the Eurosceptic debate. What follows is the first in a series of archive recordings of some of the sessions. Here, to mark the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War, historian and playwright Philip Orr and Erica Myers of the Dutch Green Foundation, Bureau de Helling, discuss the ongoing effects of the war on today's Europe. The session is introduced by Nuala Ahern, Chair of the Green Foundation Ireland.
We have Philip Orr here on my left, who has described himself to me earlier as a feral historian, which really now, pushed my buttons. I thought that was so wonderful and exciting. By which he means he's not an academic historian, but that he is really interested in his world and how it has come to be, as I think you all are, or you wouldn't be here. So I'm going to be very interested in what he is going to talk to us about tonight, which is, on the face of it, about the Great War and the anniversary of the same. Very difficult experience for all Europeans 100 years ago. Not forgetting the significant anniversary today of the D-Day landings in Normandy. And he's interested in local and world history. I'd say you are an oral historian in some ways, maybe, and he'll tell us more. That's just me. And he's written and directed for the theatre, and he is very involved in community history, which is why I sort of sussed oral history. So he's particularly interested in the Great War. I have to confess to you, who are not from here, that I was born in this town, which is not something that a lot of people know about me. And my parents were from what is euphemistically called both sides of the divide. So my mother was a girl from East Belfast, and my father was, some of you know him, certainly a Republican and a socialist. And of course they believed that in their life they could overcome everything by love and socialism, but alas, it's not quite true. Although I think love and idealism has a tremendous force in the world. So after some time they hightailed it off out of this town and brought their children up elsewhere. So that says everything there is to say about sectarianism in this place, which is not over yet, as we can see from events very recently of a racist nature by some of our most eminent politicians. I call them mine because anybody Irish belongs to me, and certainly I was born in this town. But people who can say that they would send somebody off to go shopping and bring back the change, I mean, it just beggars belief in the 21st century. So I believe there are going to be events tomorrow that will be confronting this kind of racism again. People talk a lot in the European Union about European values. Like Churchill, who said the traditions of the British Army are rum, sodomy and the lash, I think that European traditions are racism, intolerance, and domination of the rest of the world. That's where we have come from. In the 20th century, we have made valiant efforts to change that. However, I don't think that we have done enough. I think that we have done, in many ways, too little too late, but it is not over yet. We have had a terrible history as Europeans in the 20th century, and let's try to change it in the 21st. We're going to address that at some level, some deep level this weekend, but we're also going to think about it in the context of our shared history. Philip is going to talk to us tonight about that in the context of these islands. One of my dear friends in the Green European Foundation is Benoit Lechat, and he's going to be with us tomorrow and Sunday, and he's the editor of the Green European Journal. He's Belgian, and the Belgians suffered terribly in the First World War. And he talked about how his great-grandfather had been killed and all of that generation, and how when the war first came across the Belgian borders, the first people to suffer were the civilians, many civilians. And we don't hear about it. We hear about, I think nowadays, more about the sacrifice, the glorious sacrifice of the soldiers. I don't think there's anything terribly glorious about that sacrifice. I think that the Russian men who walked back and said they were not going to fight had the right idea. The fact that they were walking back into the terrible tyranny of Stalinism is another chapter. But I think they were right to just walk out of that war. But the people who tried to do that from these islands were simply shot as deserters. And we can see that rhetoric beginning again today. We can see that in the soldier who was brought back from Afghanistan and who is now being traduced as a deserter because he couldn't bear what was going on. These things are with us still. So it is not history. It is still part of our present. And with that thought in mind, I would like to hand you over to Philip to talk further this evening. We're going to do, just to structure it, Philip will talk for about 20-25 minutes. I will then introduce and invite Erica to respond. And I'll introduce her when she comes forward. And then we're going to have a group discussion so that we'll structure the 2 hours that we have together in that way. So please, over to you, Philip.
Thanks very much, Janella. Thank you. Okay, Philip Orr that's me, and I do a wide range of things. I suppose I use the word feral because I don't inhabit an academic environment, but nonetheless, I have deep interest in history and deep interest in theatre and in community development. A lot of the work that I would do is with those loyalist communities that Nuala is, referring to along with others. Stuck in an impasse here, as we still are in many ways in Northern Ireland, despite the benefits of a peace process. So looking back, what I'm going to do is look back at the First World War. I want to talk a little bit about the Second as well, but the First World War is my main focus here. And what I want to think about is the way in which that war still matters today in all kinds of ways that if you don't live here, you may be surprised by. But what I want to do is situate the First World War inside a longer period of history, first of all. The First World War is 1914 to 18, but as far as we are concerned in Ireland, and particularly it's still with us in Northern Ireland, it's the period from 1912 through to 1922 or 3 that we call the decade, well, we call it the decade of centenaries or anniversaries because they do still matter today. I mean, as individuals, we look back at our birthday. And it's not surprising that as a society, particularly a divided one such as ours in Northern Ireland, we look back and think about and at times want to commemorate aspects of that past during that incredible period. And I'll talk a little bit about what that period was for those of you not familiar with it, from 1912 to 22. But what I do want to say here is that is also the case in other parts of the world and other parts of Europe. What I mean is, if you lived in the Balkans, the South Balkans, things didn't begin to blow in 1914. The Balkan Wars prior to that, the tussle for national identity with people like the Macedonians, was going on for quite a while before that. And if you lived in Greece or Turkey, your war did not end in 1918. It continued for years afterwards with ethnic cleansing and the war that was going on, which was only finally concluded with the Treaty of Locarno in the 1920s. Do you follow me? We put 14 to 18 on it But in doing so, I think we come with a very particular perspective. The second thing I want to say, just when we're teasing out about this 14 to 18 thing, is this. I was in a conference in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, capital of that country, just 2 or 3 months back, looking at the topic, the Great War and the colonies. And what struck me there was that that was indeed a world war. And maybe a statistic that will help you appreciate that is the fact that Indians, and of course Bangladesh, Bengal was then part of India, 1.5 million Indians took part in the war. A vast array of Chinese took part as members of a labour corps. And we heard talks during the seminars and the discussions about Algerians as part of the French Empire, who, as Islamic members of that empire, were taking part in a war against the Islamic peoples who were providing much of the army in the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. So what comes across to me is that, and it comes across with regard to the Second World War as well, that we can Europeanize our thinking about it. If you lived in Manchuria, the viciousness of totalitarian rule and racism didn't start in 1939. It started a heck of a lot earlier with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And if you lived in Southeast Asia, the ongoing struggles, coloured and textured with insurrection and national identity and post-colonial struggle, continued right the way through the 1940s. So I would want to put it to you that we should maybe be more flexible about how we think about these world wars, if we are going to call them, as we so often do, world wars. But let's look a little bit again at Ireland. That period from 1912 to 22, what are we talking about there? Well, I think the reason I start in 1912, though of course you could start anywhere in a sense with history, but I start there because that is the moment whenever the British government responds to pressure to provide, if you like, a parliament for Dublin inside that empire. It's called Home Rule, a Dublin Parliament. And of course that's met with huge opposition in cities like this from Unionists, those who, mainly from a Protestant background, to some degree from a more prosperous background, who feel that their religious freedom and their economic success will be jeopardised by moving away into a semi-autonomous condition from the British Empire, which is a very prosperous place in many, many ways for its commerce. What happens then is a state of incredible tension and political difference. Armed, guns on the streets, potentially blood on the streets, a very, very tense time that we know as the Home Rule crisis. And suddenly, in 1914, the war breaks out, or relatively suddenly, and it's a game changer for all of that. Over 200,000 Irishmen go to fight in the First World War, and they go from all kinds of backgrounds. There's been a long history of Irishmen fighting in the British Army. Up to 40% of the British Army at various stages in the 19th century was Irish. Out of that number, it's disputable how many die, but possibly, let's say, 30,000. But that is not the major thing I think we want to talk about. Well, at a humanitarian level it is. But in terms of political significance, the major thing we have to think about is that a revolution breaks out in Ireland. Just as revolutions break out in Russia, just as the Great War is a game changer at all kinds of big levels in terms of the dismantling of empires, the beginning of Bolshevism and so on, the Great War is, as historians now recognise, the context for the Easter Rising, in which a combination of various insurgents, including Marxist intellectual like James Connolly and Patrick Pearse from a different kind of tradition, engage in a rising against British rule and all-out separatism. By the time the war is over, Sinn Féin, the small party, small initially, that supports that separatism and supports that rising, is beginning to surge up the polls and comes out very well in the election of 1918. In the 3 or 4 years that follow, there's chaos in this city, there's blood in the streets, there's an Irish Republican Army formed, there's a war of independence, the British try to suppress it. The outcome of the chaos, in many ways, is the partition of Ireland, a border, a 6-county northeast, still firmly under British rule, though with its own parliament, and then the Irish Free State that eventually mutates into the Irish Republic. What I'd want to say is, we have to see, I think, the creation of that border in the context of everything about Versailles and what happens out of the First World War. Borders going up everywhere. The old empires dissolving. They're already on the way to dissolution. The fact that they're on the way to dissolution in the case of Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is part of why the tinderbox of the Balkans occurs and the war starts to catch flame. So, what we're talking about then in 1918, 1921, 22 is the creation of a border and highly disgruntled minorities on either side of it. Does that sound familiar in Europe? In the south, a much smaller minority than the minority that happens in the north, a smaller Protestant unionist-oriented minority, which eventually some leave, go north, some leave, go elsewhere, but many adapt very well, indeed, to the changes. In the north, a much more substantial Catholic nationalist minority. Things simmered for many decades, but then in the 60s, in that era of post-colonial discourse and civil rights around the world, there's a means to start to look for change, and you have a civil rights movement blockaded by unionism very severely, and that explodes into the conflict that we know about as the Troubles, rather euphemistically, from 1969 through until the 1990s. So, what I'm saying then is that the war is at the heart of that. It's a game changer, it's a function, it's an important event for Ireland in so many ways. It licenses that Easter Rising because there has a long tradition in Ireland, despite our peripheral place, of when times of conflict emerge in Europe, we seek out help from Europe in order to have an insurgency, an attempt to throw off that British rule. It happened in the 1790s. France was invited in. Back in the early modern period, the Spaniards. And now, of course, people like Roger Casement, in the case of the Easter Rising leadership, he's roughly Easter Rising leadership, slightly on the periphery of it, goes to seek help in Germany. So it is very much a war-oriented and war context event. Now, why does that war still matter today in ways that are significant for our divided Northern Ireland? And it really, really does. The first thing is just to talk a little bit or gloss that notion of a divided society. I think I've given you some reasons, obviously, why we are divided here. Unionism and nationalism, if you like. A sense of tectonic plates there, of rubbing up in different directions. And a sense of uncertainty about what's going to actually happen to Northern Ireland. Despite a peace process, I think, despite having our House on the Hill, Stormont government, devolved government, a sense of uncertainty. For example, the demographics. Demographics constantly swerve and change. You can't always predict them. But what's beginning to look like the case is that if you look at the census for young people's primary school-aged children, that is actually a majority of folk young people coming from the perceived Catholic nationalist background. So you can see why there's still volatility there, there's uncertainty. And when the future is uncertain, the past becomes crucial. When you're uncertain what's out there ahead of you, you look back to the past. And in a society where civic space is always a difficult one, shared space is always a difficult one in a divided society, to stage rituals and ceremonies that embrace the past and deal with that narrative about the past becomes very, very important. Understand that? Yeah? Does that seem like a fair point? And that is indeed what happens. So when it comes in our society to 2016, although it's a founding narrative for the Irish Republic, and of course there are issues about what happened after Easter 1916, divisive events in the Civil War and all that rear their head when you start to look back at history. Nonetheless, it's a founding narrative of a modern European state. Here it's different. It's unfinished business. And if you start to actually have ceremonies to celebrate the Easter Rising, to commemorate it, and you put them in civic space around our city hall, you're doing something that is potentially very, very challenging. Because that civic space, when unionism had hegemony here, was dedicated to the unionist cause. The city hall was where the Ulster Covenant was signed, the famous document that was at the heart of the unionist project many years ago. Do you follow me? So once you start to get ceremonies and rituals of acknowledgement of that period of the Easter Rising, although it's very affirmative for nationalists and Republicans in the North, it also looks very destabilising to Unionists. Likewise, for many in the Unionist community, the whole period of the First World War is very, very important. And why is it important? Well, back in 1914, we've got that coming up, August the 5th, August the 4th, at the start of the First World War, 100 years on. Unionists and Loyalists will want to commemorate that, they'll want to engage in recalling it, because to remember 1914 is to remember empire as it was. It's to remember Britain as it was when you were deeply part of it, when the flag was carried around the world. It's to remember a Britain that's very different in some ways, in many ways, from now, but unionism doesn't quite fit into anymore. You follow me? Mm-hmm. And so that recollection is important. It's also a simplifying thing to remember that First World War, because in the period just before it, I mean, the Ulster Volunteers, which had been raised by the Unionists in order to make sure that Home Rule wouldn't come, in arming that set of Ulster Volunteers, a kind of militia to fight for the Empire, but to fight against the Empire, to stay in the Empire, if you follow the complexity of that, armed itself with guns from Hamburg, from a Jewish arms dealer called Bruno Spiro. 3 months later, they were fighting the Germans. So there's a very complicated story inside unionism that's often quite adversarial and often very contractual in terms of allegiance and what you get from Britain for it. But the story of going to the Somme in 1916, where 2,000 young Unionists, soldiers in the Ulster Division fought and died, and another 5,000 were injured, that story, which will be remembered in July 2016, and the beginning of the war and the end of it, will be an opportunity to remember and also to simplify that remembrance. Does that make sense? To remember and also to do the thing we always are aiming to do, I think, in danger of aiming to do in public memory, to simplify. And to stage that in terms of remembrance and ceremony will be very important. Can you see then how the war and the rising, which I'm arguing is at the heart of it for Ireland, these things matter very much indeed. What I want to suggest here is, well, what I want to talk about is some of the work that I personally have been involved in. You can give me responses as to whether you think it's valid or not. But some of the work that I have been trying to be actively involved in, to try to think about those narratives that I've referred to about the war and the rising, and seeing as there's some other way that we can tell them or make them more complex. I referred earlier to the whole business of oral history. One of the things I did, a lucky man, back in the late 1980s, was to meet some of the old men who had actually been in the war as veterans. And as you can imagine, that's a privilege, because you go with your tape recorder, you listen, you write it down, and you accumulate it, and then eventually it became a crucial component of my first book about the Battle of the Somme in Irish history. And just listening to those individualised stories, I think, and trying to have those at the heart of how we remember a war is an important first step. Now, the thing about oral history is we can't be naive about it. There's a lot of understanding that oral history doesn't necessarily tell you a more authentic or truthful thing than academic history. But nonetheless, with judicious care, you can find things from oral history that ground the war in somewhere else rather than that big corporate thing, the big corporate story. Yeah? And I think, I hope that the work that I did and subsequent work that other historians indeed have done on that project helps to ground some way the narrative. But a project that I'm working quite hard on at the moment is this. It's to do with looking at the home front. Now, I know that if you were in somewhere like the Bloodlands, Timothy Snyder, the brilliant historian, talks about the Bloodlands in Europe. Those areas particularly between the titans of Bolshevism and Nazism during the 20th century, that suffered way, way the most. You know, if you're in that context, to make a difference between the home front and the military front is invidious. But in Ireland in the First World War, there was the home front. It was well away from the main fighting. And to actually look at that home front is absolutely fascinating. And I'll try to explain why in a moment. But what I'm engaged in is a project at Cultra, at a folk park that we have. It's a folk and transport museum, but at the folk park we've got about 50 buildings, mostly vernacular, from roughly 100 years ago, and people go around and enjoy a day out, looking at a blacksmith shop, a grocer's shop, a church, and all of that. But there's a danger with projects like that. You can end up imagining that in the past all we did was shoe horses and make soda bread. If you don't know what soda bread is, imagine it. Okay? We had a nice experience. It's folk, not just folk, but folks. Don't quote that. Okay?
Tweet it already.
Don't tweet it! You did not, did you? That's the project over, am I? Can you untweet it straight away?
With Little House on the
Yeah, there's a little bit of a danger of that. You follow me? And I'm sure there's an equivalent in national stories presented as tourist venues, isn't there? You know, the folksy story. But what we've been already doing, actually, with the help of some actors and so on, and we're going to do more of, is try to take challenging and difficult histories at the folk park and try to enact them and bring them out. So during the First World War period coming up in August, visitors will be invited to go around and find some of the following things. For example, and I've done the research for this, and I think we're getting to factual stuff. When you go to that little sweet shop the kids love to go to, right? If you've been, you'll know this little sweet shop, a little corner shop. And during that First World War period, those windows, believe you me, would have been full of toys for boys, guns, little, we know this, little uniformed soldiers, artillery pieces, bullets, imaginary stuff. The girls had, instead of having dolls, had little nurses. They had hospitals instead of houses. The boys had little forts. They had biographies of great British soldiers. You get it? Mm-hmm. And you go to the church and you remember the fact that Boy Scouts would have come in to hear services, church services, in which the clergyman would have preached a fairly strong-minded kind of patriotic speech. And you realise, of course, that the Scouts, like a lot of those uniformed organisations for boys, creditable to what they were trying to do, in some ways, they're formed very recently before the First World War, are actually militarising the mindset of kids who then eventually head off to the front. You go to somewhere connected with sport on the site at Cultra, and you remember that sport is a fairly organised sport, spectator sport. It's not all that long ago. It's to do with the Industrial Revolution, people, moving to the town, the city, no longer such active lives, and here you can bring them together for mass spectator sport. Let me give you an anecdote that I will use at the folk park from a local paper. A boy at the front in the army says he's very proud to be a grenadier. He's learnt to throw grenades. And who does he write back to? His cricket club. To say that he's learnt how to throw his grenade as a bowler at the cricket club. Now, I'm not blaming Sailfield Cricket Club for starting the First World War, but you will get my point. You will get my point that sport, in a kind of way, played a role so that when you got to the front, and look at the discourse of a lot of the letters back, you kind of thought you were going to an advanced men's version of sport. Throwing, yeah? So, trying to learn a few things. The fact about war is that when we touched on this, civilians, women and children. Where is the women and children's story in our narratives about the First and Second World War? Where is it? Certainly in Ireland, where is it? Maybe in other environments, in other countries, yes, it's been because if you have mass bombardment of your cities and civilians are wiped out, you have to face that and deal with that. We didn't have that. But what about the women's and children's story? And you begin, you walk around to discover that the girls who would have been working in that particular factory there were often the munitions industry. There's the girls who used to gut fish at our Glass, which is one of our fishing ports, are not there anymore to do the fish. Where are they? The munitions industry in Glasgow or in Belfast, making shells for the Somme. So in actual fact, we too experienced total war, but we experienced it in a different way. The 20th century wars were total wars. Now, it's even more borne in upon you if, you're living in the city of Dresden when there's bombardment, or you're living in Belgium whenever it's, taken over by the German forces coming in 1914. But we too were involved in that, and women and children are on, I was going to say the front line, but they're the back story. They've been militarised at all junctures. So I have had to sort of shorten that a wee bit because I'm conscious of time, but you see what I mean by addressing the home front, what it starts to do. You look at the backstories, you start to re-gender the thing, you start to look at the role of the arms industry in all of this. You begin, as you visit the church, to realise that religion has a key role to play in all of this. And of course, we know it well enough in Ireland where the Ulster Covenant adduced God in it, and the Easter Declaration on the steps, not the lower steps, on front of the GPO in 1916, adduced God, that nationalism, just as much as the old imperialism, tended to bring in the warrior God at some level. So you see, what I'm saying here is, I'm trying to offer that as a recipe. We have to start finding ways to address the narratives we've got here about these big wars in our part of the world. Just in the last little space here, a couple of things. First of all, I haven't talked much about the Second World War, and I'm sorry about that. We'll maybe discuss it a little bit in our debating session. But I'm very conscious of some of the really excellent books that I've read. I just want to mention them. Different books I've read and some of the issues I've thought about. I mean, books about the Balkans. I read a fantastic book recently, and I can't remember the author. It's called 1941. Does anybody know this book? 1941. And it's actually a narrative that has been retrieved about the whole experience of Ustashi in Croatia. And I suppose why I'm mentioning it is if you know this story, I mean, it's just a horror story during the Second World War where the Ustashi regime in Croatia ends up butchering many Serbs and many Jews. Now, it's always more complex than an Irishman talking about it. But one of the points he argues is that, when the regime of Tito came into power, in a sense, it looked like the thing had been dealt with because there was a fairly authoritarian, but in some ways, in other ways, relatively liberal regime, and perhaps, Tito had brought some kind of stability and some kind of reconciliation, but argues that it didn't because nobody talked about it enough. It wasn't dealt with, it wasn't processed, it wasn't brought through, and thought about. And so when the Tito regime eventually disappears, it's all going to come surging back up again. So I think now, I'm not sure that I know enough to argue very, very authoritatively about that. But there's an interesting point here as to in what ways, and to what degree after a war, do we need truth recovery and a dealing with what has actually happened? And of course that's very relevant for us in Northern Ireland, because there's all kinds of debates about to what degree can that happen, or should it happen. On the other hand, I've read Tony Judd's book. I don't know whether you've read Tony Judd, but his book Post-War is a fascinating tome, in which he argues, if I'm not kind of nobbling him and bringing him down to too small a point, that if Europe had tried to deal with all the justice issues, all the injustice issues, of the Second World War, we would still be having tribunals, and that at some level it had to be kind of put on one side. Certain, like the Nuremberg trial, for example, certain key and at some level symbolic events, like the Nuremberg trial happened, but then the whole process of going ahead with rebuilding was the important thing, economic rebuilding. Now, I'm maybe laming his argument a bit, but you see some of the issues I'm trying to bring out here. Is it important to look back into the past and bring out some of the big issues? And find some kind of reconciliation, at least through truth recovery, if not through a process of legal justice. These are some of the things I think that come out for me, particularly from the Second World War. I will mention one interesting thing here, just for your consideration as well. Ray Davy, fascinating old man, died recently in his late 80s, I think. And I met him, and I read his prison diaries. Ray Davy was a Presbyterian minister, became a chaplain, ended up prisoner of war in Germany, and was near Dresden when Dresden was bombed. He was devastated by witnessing this, because what it brought out, of course, is the moral complexity, if not the moral contradiction, of being there, knowing that Germany, in a sense, had to be beaten, the Jews, all the terrible things that had happened, the need to get rid of that Nazi regime, and yet witnessing carpet bombing taking place in order to create that. And then, to make it even more complicated and difficult, he got to know some German families in a little village called Hohenstein. When he left, he wanted to get in touch with them again, and the Iron Curtain came down. And he couldn't meet them again, which haunted him. Yeah, European history here in Belfast. But out of that, intriguingly, he eventually got back to East Germany, but he never found in the 1970s or 80s, never found that family again. But out of that experience, that European experience, he founded a community in the it's 50 years ago, so what's that, mid-1960s? Called the Corrymeela community on the north coast, which is, I think it's fair to say, probably the single most significant community community organisation in terms of dealing with with a broadly Christian ethos, but only in the most broad and non-sectional way, right? Dealing with the whole issue of our troubles as they started to emerge in '69. So it's a place where many people have gone down through the years, perpetrators, victims, those who feel they're neither, those who are affected by the whole thing. And so in some interesting way out of that Dresden experience, which doesn't, of course, I hope, sentimentalise that awful experience, but out of it nonetheless, that little seed of some kind of possibility. I want to say one last thing, okay, to ponder, and I'd like your advice. I am now represented by a UKIP councillor. UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party. I live in Carrickfergus, which is a loyalist and unionist citadel. Don't tweet anything. Don't tweet any of this, right?
Lives are at stake.
Lives are at stake. Believe you me, lives are at stake here. But a UKIP councillor has been voted in. I'm intrigued as to why that has happened in Carrickfergus near Belfast, in a loyalist unionist community, in the light of what I've talked to you about and all the stuff I've shared with you. And secondly, we have don't tweet this either, we have a war memorial in Carrickfergus which has recently been refurbished. And Carrickfergus is 30,000 people roughly. It's the size of something you'd see in Stalingrad.
Socialist realism.
It's massive. Why? Why are those wars coming up again like that so intensely? I've tried to give you some clues, do some thinking to give me back some answers. And why is UKIP flourishing a little bit in places here and there throughout Northern Ireland? That's me. Thank you.
amazing, rich, and to be continued. We haven't done with you yet. Very interesting questions risen for us here. But before we begin to... Okay. So before we begin to think about, in detail, about what Philip has been talking to us about, I would like to ask Erica Myers to come forward. Please welcome her. Erica is editor-in-chief of De Helling, the quarterly journal of the Bureau de Helling, which is the Dutch, our sister foundation in Holland. And she's worked as a radio journalist and also with printed media, but and she's dealt with politics, with populism, with various cultural questions. But I think most interesting for me, she's a theologian. I was trying to tease out from her earlier just what part of the Dutch spectrum she was a theologian of, but she just said, call me a Protestant theologian, which is very Dutch, very conceptual. And I'm interested in theology for two reasons. One is I have a very dear friend, Mary Condren, who's a feminist theologian, and so I've done stuff with her over the years, because feminist theologians are very confronting, as you know, of the Christian narrative. And the other reason is that as I get older, I'm increasingly at a loss as to how to teach our young to lead a good life. And I know that theologians think about these things. I think you do anyway, hope you do, because if you don't, who does? And it is something that confronts all of us as mothers, grandmothers, and extended family. We live in a difficult world. It's a transitional world, and we've heard something about the violence that has been instrumental in the creation of Europe in the modern times. But those questions, I think, are the wide context which we're talking about. I am actually going to also ask some questions about the greater, I would say, globalization, industrialization context, because I think that the Great War and the Second World War were truly industrial wars. They were wars of the modern era. They created, we had in Europe an image of ourselves as civilized, and after Second World War in particular, but even the Great War, as we used to call it, we could no longer think of ourselves in Europe as preeminently civilized on this planet. And I think that was a great blow to our self-esteem. And I don't think we have recovered from it yet. And I think that the theology has great answers and great thoughts about this. So please,
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I think I was not invited as a theologian here, but so I didn't prepare nothing specifically theologically. But I think of course, it influences the attitude in the background. So I wrote my speech down because otherwise I have to look for words all the time. My English is not good enough to speak as freely as that. So as I walked into this beautiful university, before the first thing I saw was this huge monument for those of the university who sacrificed themselves in the First and the Second World War, here in front of the door, with this young man in the arms of an angel, I think. What they sacrificed themselves for is not mentioned. It's only saying they sacrificed themselves. And I think it deserves a question mark. And all over Europe, of course, you find these kind of monuments. I will try to talk about the European perspective of the way we remember the wars. And I will also especially talk about the First World War. So it's almost 100 years ago now, on the 28th of July 1914, that the Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and this was the opening act of the First World War, which lasted 4 devastating years, caused the death of over 15 million people, and left 20 million people injured and maimed. It was a European catastrophe, which brought a disaster upon the rest of the world. Peace lasted only 20 years, and it took another even more devastating war before European leaders realized things had to change. So when Europeans commemorate the beginning of the First World War this summer, we should be reflecting not only on the political causes of the war and the human tragedy it caused, but also on the start of a new era for Europe, the birth of a European project that began with the Schuman Declaration in 1950, which evolved into the European Union as we know it today. So what is the connection between remembering war and building a sustainable European community? That's the question. The EU has been considered a success story for many years, but at least since the outbreak of the financial crisis in 2007-2008, the European Union has come under pressure with the rise of Eurosceptic, populist and nationalist forces. We already talked about it. Are the European Union institutions and the member states ready to continue and strengthen the integration process? Will they try harder to reach out to citizens and re-involve them in the project, which has given them more than 60 years of peace and relative prosperity? Or will European countries return to their nationalist past with all the consequences? I think we are at a crossroad for Europe today. In this context, it becomes of crucial importance to discuss the role of the wars of the 20th century in Europe today. Why is it still important to commemorate them now that they're shifting further and further away from us, now that direct memories are fading away? To be able to answer this, we need to ask ourselves another question. What do we actually commemorate? And how do we commemorate the wars? And what do we want to commemorate? And what do we want to remember? And what do we want our children to remember? Before I go into these questions, I want to propose you a small series of pictures made and composed by the French-Mexican artist Philip McIntyre, who lives in Amsterdam. Here you see it in a miniature. His grandfather, who was a French captain, army, he was a soldier. He was also in the colonies, he was a colonial soldier. And he fought as a captain in World War I. He was in the Somme, he was in Verdun, and he was in many other places. He suffered from mustard gas, and he died young. During this war, he sent postcards home, photographs of himself and his battalion. And Philippe, who never knew his grandfather, found these postcards in his mother's archive. And he made them into a personal commemoration of war and as a kind of dedication to the unknown soldiers. Let's have a look. And now you can start it. I hope it goes automatically. What image of war do we get through these pictures? I cannot really answer that question. I think it's up to each of you. I just show them as a possible way of remembering the war, or as a starting point for telling stories about the war and about our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-grandmothers as well, indeed. The proposition I will try to defend tonight is the following. If we want to maintain a sustainable European democracy and a pluralistic and peaceful European community, we should commemorate our old wars not only at a national and local level, but especially at a European level. And in short, these are my arguments. I already gave them before I really start explaining more. If you commemorate only at a national level, which is often the case, You reproduce a nationalistic and often even militaristic rhetoric, which is, I think, not helpful for the reinforcement of European collaboration, which we obviously need to solve a lot of international problems. The risk even exists that you commemorate and honor the same nationalistic rhetorics that led Europe into war before. If you commemorate at a European level, national stories will meet each other. This can be confronting and painful. It is a difficult, but I think very necessary exercise in listening to each other, and in doing so, in building trust between peoples and cultures. Without this trust, even the economic and financial collaboration in Europe will collapse in the long run. If you commemorate at a European level, you escape the nationalistic frame, and by doing so, you are creating the space to commemorate those who fought in the wars and despised the war. The anti-fascists, the deserters, the ones who lost all their faith in a military way of solving conflicts, and those for whom nationalism was bankrupt. And those are usually absent in these official national commemorations. So let me try to explain all this. For many European countries, 1914-1918 is etched into the collective memory as an inferno that transformed the high-flown expectations of the century which just begun into desperation and hate. As the French poet Paul Valéry wrote in 1919, just after the war, we civilizations now know that we are mortal, just as you just said. How do we memorialize this war a century later? Mainly at a national level. Each country has its own monuments and ceremonies, and thus tries to assign meaning and weight to the events of 1418 in a way that jives with its own national history. Two important elements are consequently absent from these remembrances. First, the sense of futility and the revulsion for nationalism that the Great War evoked in many participants, regardless of whose trenches they fought in. And secondly, the fact that the First World War was not only experienced by the country having its own commemoration. All over Europe, soldiers and citizens suffered by the war. What exactly was this Europe-wide experience? The First World War swept away not only a whole world, but a widely held conception of Europe. Modernity, until then, had stood for continual progress in knowledge, technology, welfare, and, encapsulating the whole project, humanity itself. The modern European could not only expect to enjoy a better life, but also to become a better person in moral respect. He would think for himself, shake off old myths and uncertainties, and, helped by art, continually strive to reach a higher spiritual plane. This outlook inevitably drew some skepticism. The three masters of suspicion had posed their trenchant questions. Freud about the rationality of humankind, Marx about capitalist industrialization, and Nietzsche about morality and religion. And also, already in the 16th century, questions were asked about human rights. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, did this in behalf of the Indians in the New World. So modern Europe was from the outset open to critique and explicit self-questioning. That is exactly what made it into a modern society. But the dark side of this fundamentally optimistic world was not to be revealed until the short 20th century. And then in a catastrophic way, I cannot pronounce this correctly. In retrospect, it is shocking to read that many of the most respected thinkers and intellectuals of the time went so enthusiastically, with so much enthusiasm to war. Thanks to all the achievement of modern technology, it was assumed the war would soon be over, bringing fame and boost to national morale. It would be a war to end all wars. Paul Valéry observed in his essay La crise de l'esprit that progress had itself paved the way for carnage. It was technical and scientific knowledge combined with moral attributes like loyalty and discipline that made evil on this scale possible. So many horrors, and I'm citing him now, could not have been possible without so many virtues, he wrote. To Valéry, the Great War amounted to a bankruptcy of idealism, of the idea that human spirit shored up the world and made it ever better. Idealism had been replaced by a profound sense of futility. The soldiers from practically all over Europe who fought in the trenches shared not only the experiences of cold, hunger, mud, and rats, together with the appalling awareness that every second could be one's last, but also too often the realization that everything they had learned about the good life had now become meaningless. The German soldier and writer Erich Maria Remarque wrote in his novel Im Westen nichts Neues, in English it's called All Quiet on the Western Front, in 1929. It was very famous. The protagonist of this book describes how the worldview handed down by school teachers who had recruited their pupils for the war burst asunder with every grenade and every fatality. And lying wounded in a field hospital at the end of the book, he says, "A man cannot realize that above such shattered bodies there are still human faces in which life goes its daily round." And this is only one hospital, one single station. There are hundreds of thousands in Germany, hundreds of thousands in France, hundreds of thousands in Russia. How senseless is everything that can ever be written, done, or thought when such things are possible. It must be all lies and of no account when the culture of 1,000 years could not prevent this stream of blood being poured out, these torture chambers in their hundreds of thousands. And that same year, the English writer Richard Ellington portrayed his own war experiences in the novel Death of a Hero. It is an account of his disillusionment with the Victorian mentality as well as an ode to a much envied dead soldier. And I also share a fragment of this with you. He writes, "What right do I have to live? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Is it 20 million? What does the exact count matter? There they are, and we are responsible. Tortures of hell, we are responsible. When I meet an unnamed man of my generation, I want to shout at him, 'How did you escape? How did you dodge it? What dirty trick did you play? Why are you not dead, trickster?' It is dreadful to have outlived your life, to have shared your fate, to have overspent your welcome. There's nobody upon earth who cares whether I live or die. And I'm glad of it, so glad of it, to be alone, icily alone. You, the war dead, I think you died in vain. I think you died for nothing, for a blast of wind, a bladder, a humbug, a newspaper stunt, politicians ran. But at least you died. You did not reject the sharp, sweet shock of bullets, the sudden smash of shell burst, the insinuating agony of poison gas. You got rid of it all. You choose the better part." It is very easy to find passages like this in other French, Belgian, and Russian novels. So it's this feeling of meaninglessness which got Paul Valéry to conclude his essay with the observation that nationalism is intellectually bankrupt and idealism is murdered. Knowledge he writes, had demonstrated its impotence to salvage anything from the wreckage. Science had been dishonored by the application of its inventions and was fatally wounded in its moral ambitions. The illusions of a European culture had vanished. So the First World War did destroy the budding collaboration of an elite of European writers and artists, as well as a provoking dissolution of the Second International, Socialist International. It seemed like the triumph of nationalism over these efforts towards a European-wide culture and politics. But although nationalism remained a powerful force, as we know it still does, some people concluded, like Valéry, that nationalism was from now on a hollow as a political tenable ideal. And among those who believed this were disillusioned young nihilists. It found its expression in new artistic movements like Dada, which was founded in Zurich in 1916 as a reaction against the horrors of the war. And after the First World War, the movement of pacifists was never as big. Many young Europeans nourished a profound mistrust of militarism and authoritarianism. The cry of no more war was heard everywhere. But it took another war until it found its political expression in the collaboration of the European community. In this way, the First World War was a European-wide experience, and Europeans all over the continent shared it. But it was a paradoxical experience because what they shared was the feeling that Europe didn't exist anymore, that Europe had lost its culture, had lost its ambitions, and that life itself made no sense anymore. So we have to say this shared experience was in the same time a dividing experience. Because, as we all know, the First World War, followed by the Second, hacked Europe into pieces. The Germans were widely hated for many decades. The Russian Revolution divided the continent into two camps. The British lost their empire and withdrew into their island. Belgium faced a growing rift between its Flemish and its Walloon communities. For Poland, 1918 meant the end of an era of foreign domination that had lasted since 1795. The collapse of the Habsburg double monarchy set off a complicated, arduous process of nation forming in the Balkans. So the impact of the war on political relationships varies from country to country and from region to region. People remain divided by questions of placing blame, making amends for the suffering. The existence of a common experience is therefore a precarious assumption. What people underwent, whether communally or individually, is moreover interpreted and commemorated differently. Clearly, there is no such thing as an objective, complete knowledge of the First World War, neither of the Second or any war or anything. We can never really know what it was like. Partly because it was different for everyone, and partly because history is an ingredient of our outlook on today and the future. In Europe, political and social relations are always a confrontation of different experiences, in which our perception of the other and the other stories is once again colored by our own history and experience. The First World War is therefore simultaneously a shared European experience, in which Europeans can find a common understanding, and a dividing experience that makes us mutual strangers. Is there any point then in commemorating the First World War in Europe? The question is in certain respects superfluous because it already takes place. This year in particular, there will be countless remembrance ceremonies. The point is that these commemorations, I already said before, will practically all be national ones, although a few cross-border ceremonies are being organized. Diplomats, as well as a few heads of state, will attend one another's ceremonies. The main problem with these occasions is that they do not do justice to the conclusion drawn by the many profoundly disillusioned survivors of the trenches, that nationalism is intellectually bankrupt, as Paul Valéry argued. Instead of recognizing the problematic nature of national rhetoric that led up to the war, they reproduce the same nationalistic discourse all over again. A good example of this, maybe you know it, is the UK Royal Mint's announcement of a coin to be issued this year in remembrance of the First World War. The coin bears the image of Field Marshal Lord Kitchener from the iconic wartime poster captioned, "Your country wants you." In such way of commemorating, there is no room for an experience such as that portrayed in the novels of Richard Eldington and Erich Maria Remarque. A new style of remembrance is therefore needed, one which fosters cooperation between Europeans, but which reflects the diverse narratives. A remembrance which recognizes the European element of the war and in the same time respects the national differences. A remembrance which desires for strengthening of the bonds between European people, but in the same time remembers that it was the First World War, followed by the Second, that smashed down the existing European culture. In such a remembrance, the European Union could act as a symbol for the defeat of nationalism. In this respect, it is a good thing that the EU has nothing heroic. It is rather an untidy aggregate held together by historical coincidences and political compromises. The EU has many defects, and it is precisely because it is still searching for an appropriate political shape that the EU is well qualified to undertake the organization of a new kind of remembrance. A kind that does not focus on national honor, on sacrifices, etc., but on the horrors of nationalism. Commemorations of this kind also needs to be framed within a specific political and symbolic context, of course. But because this will not be a nationalistic context, it will create space for the remembrance of experiences that have up till now been almost entirely excluded from the commemorations. If I have still time, I want to tell you a small story about the Second World War, because of course you can ask if these arguments also hold in regards to the remembrance of the Second World War. And I would like to tell you a small personal story. A year after the Berlin Wall fell down, I did an internship in a church in the eastern part of Berlin. I got along very well with the minister of the church, and after some time he started to tell me stories of his life. And he told me that in the spring of 1945, he and his brother were mobilized at the age of 17 and 18 years old to go and fight in a war that was already lost. Most people just wanted the war to be over by then in Germany, just like anywhere else. Bruno, that was his name, was sent to the Western Front, and his younger brother to the East. His brother died shortly afterwards in the Russian hell at 17 years old. Bruno went to the West, and he was confronted with the chaotic withdrawing army. Every day, a lot of soldiers deserted, but if they were caught, they were shot as traitors. One day, somewhere in the Lüneburger moors, Bruno had to execute a deserted fellow soldier. He refused, taking the risk to be executed himself. His punishment was to watch the execution. And his whole life, he has felt guilty about this. And he kept asking himself if he should not have thrown himself in front of the execution peloton. Shortly afterwards, he deserted himself and gave himself in the hands of the first Allied forces he met. 2 years as a prisoner of war followed, during which he converted himself to Christianity and decided to become a minister. The Declaration of Darmstadt from 1947, in which German Protestant churches were called to confess their guilt, that they had sustained the National Socialist regime, the Deutsche Christen did that. This declaration became his conviction. He dedicated his whole life to the reconciliation between nations and peoples. During my internship in Berlin, I heard a lot of war stories, and for the first time in my life, they came from the other side. My parents had given me an anti-German education. As a kid, I saw German as a big black hole where all the evil of the world lived, something like that. But when I was in Berlin, I realized for the first time that a lot of Germans also really suffered during the war. And this experience, more than any other experience, made me into a European. The slogan, "No more war," which was constitutive for the European Union, doesn't mean anything if we are not ready to acknowledge that the same history has very different faces. It is very well possible, I think, to make a difference between the Nazis and their victims, and in the same time commemorate Germans that were sent to war when they were still children. In the Netherlands, we have a fierce debate about the question if it is allowed to commemorate Germans on our National Remembrance Day. This would fade out the difference between aggressors and victims, is the argument against it. And I absolutely want to maintain this difference, but I would like to disconnect it from the national question, because it was precisely his war experience that made Bruno Schottstedt is his full name, a guide and a mentor to me in peace and justice. And I remember him with a lot of respect. So if we want the project of European cooperation to root itself more deeply than just in administrative and commercial circles, or if we want wider public support for development of the Union, we cannot avoid looking our old ghosts in the eye. To find our way out of the present European stalemate of, on the one hand, a lack of economic solidarity, and on the other hand, the deficiency of democratic legitimacy and organization, we shall have to create the space in which mutual trust can grow. To achieve such a space, it will be crucial that we are conscious of one another's historic grievances and of how they have subsequently affected the shape of politics. The dead can no longer speak. Their future has never become a reality. And Europe is now what it is due to all those unfulfilled promises. The living will have to declare what moves them and what they cherish, what they have lost and what they hope to become one day. This may create the space and the mutual trust that the European Union so desperately needs if it is to act in harmony. And I have still some, but we can talk about it, some ideas of how you can do this, commemorate at the European level. But I think it's important that we have some time also to exchange and hear what your thoughts are. So I want just to finish share a final quote of Paul Valéry, who was asked, "What is peace?" And his answer was this: peace is perhaps that state of things in which the natural hostility between men is manifested in creation rather than destruction, as in war. So despite all the inevitably political tensions, the European Union is, along with other European organizations, ideally suited to creating new forms of remembrance and coexistence. So just as a monetary union cannot function without the support of economic strategy, and just as solidarity in Europe depends on a minimum standard of social security for everyone, political cooperation can only thrive when it's bolstered by interchange of those narratives that make us who we are.
Erica, I would like to thank you for that really powerful story about why we should commemorate our wars, our European wars together and not separately. I think that is a huge message from what you said. I myself was particularly moved by the photographs of your great-grandfather. I think it was your great-grandfather. I found myself in tears looking at those good men who should have been fathers, husbands, who were brothers, of course, and sons. And remembering my own great aunt who mourned her husband all her life, who died in the Great War and who never had children. And of course it was the men who experienced the terrible, terrible conditions of those wars. But the women grieved for decades, all their lives, and suffered. And it really was. It was a spear in the heart of Europe, and its spirituality and its philosophy of itself, its belief in itself, and we must deal with that together. So without more ado, I want to hear from all of you. We've had a really powerful experience from our two speakers. Please come back to us, Philip. And I don't blame you for not wanting a minute, but I do see a hand up here. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for what I thought were two really stimulating talks. A really excellent experience. What I wanted to say was try and put a few remarks together. Firstly, I think we need to be really careful about our understandings of what life before the First World War was like. I think there's a romantic view of it because the people who speak to us about it are those who enjoy the fruits of the work of the many. The Belle Epoque was a Belle Epoque for a very small elite, and it happens to be their poetry that we read, it happens to be their photographs that we look at. And I think there's an interesting point to be made that actually the experience of the trenches was not that much different to the experience of laissez-faire capitalism for most people in Europe. The children who were working in jute factories, the children who were put out to work in the fields, all of those people had a pretty rough experience of laissez-faire capitalism at that time. So it wasn't that the First World War ruined something for everyone. It ruined things for a very small number of people. I wanted also to say that there's an interesting thing, I think, for those of us who've grown up in the United Kingdom, which is that I think very strongly the Second World War is the foundational myth of the United Kingdom. Every nation has its foundational myth, and I think it's the Second World War that's Britain's foundational myth, because Britain stood alone in the world against fascism, and you know, were you to characterise Britain, it might be the bulldog characterisation of Churchill. And I think we find talking about the First World War really difficult because of that. And I think we find it really difficult because our governing class got it so badly wrong. And I think there's a really interesting movement by our current Education Secretary to try and reclaim the idea that you should just trust podge boys, because when they lead you over the top, the result might not be that bad. And there's a really interesting rewriting of history being attempted there, and an attempt to overturn the idea that were encapsulated in Such a Lovely War and in Blackadder. And I wanted to say one final thing, which is I think that we have a really problematic relationship with nationalism, but it may be that, and I was really struck by the results of the European election, where the debtor countries, the countries in southern Europe, voted to the left. Syriza won in Greece, the Democrats won in Italy, the first time the left won an election in Italy. Left parties did very well in Spain. Meanwhile, the countries from which austerity is being imposed all voted to the right. And I think actually within the United Kingdom you can see that. I live in Edinburgh, and Scotland voted first and second for social democratic parties, the SNP and Labour, because of the perception that austerity is being imposed from outside. And that's an articulation of resistance to totalising global capitalism. I don't think that nationalism is a very helpful way to do that. I don't think that's a very helpful place to resist global capitalism from. I think it's all we've got left. And I think we need to find and build other ways to resist that totalising destruction of global capitalism. I'd be interested in a discussion about those.
I'm going to take 4 questions and then, or 4 or 6, depending on how they pan out. And I'm going to ask first, yourself.
Yeah, and basically, Gregor myself could mention, and
please, would you say your name?
It's Gregor. My name is Gregor Klaus. I was very struck by some thoughts because, especially from the UK perspective, you always, as you said yourself, you view this first world renewed through prism of the second, and a lot of history gets redone that way, I think. Which is quite interesting. But what struck me really about the talk earlier was the idea that we should have a shared European remembrance. Because, funnily enough, there have been attempts of that. Like there's the German-French cooperation TV station Arte, which actually produced a film called Joyeux Noël, or Merry Christmas, where basically a commemoration of 3 sides of the same war were was attempted, basically, happening in French, German, and English, Scottish, basically telling the same story of the Christmas pieces that no one ever talks about, where people from all sides just stopped fighting and came out of the trenches, celebrated Christmas together, played football, and afterwards, in many cases, refused to continue fighting each other. And this kind of positive remembrance can come out of, I think, European cooperation, but I think that has to happen at the media level as well, because as long as we have this very nation-focused national media, you will always have that problem that it's going to reflect on yourself, not on others necessarily. And I think that's why I think art is an interesting project, even though it has slightly autistic problems sometimes.
Thank you. Please.
I'm trying to relate the discussion to a discussion which is happening now in the Irish Republic, because for us it is not just a commemoration of the First World War, but also a commemoration of the struggle for national independence, which was simultaneous before and after. And the viewpoint has been expressed in the Republic that we should not go overboard in commemorating the First World War, because it might distract people, or it might serve to convince people that the struggle for national independence, or that the war for national independence, had not actually been necessary. I'm not at all sure that it's the job of historians to decide whether a struggle was necessary or not. Like most people in the Republic, I had relatives on both sides. And am I to decide who was right and who was wrong? But can I adopt, as Erica said, sort of to commemorate it on the European level? I'm not sure how it is possible to commemorate on a European level something that is so intimately bound up with the national question, which in Ireland or in any other country.
I just want to
I want
to actually endorse that, because in Ireland at the moment we only focused on the national level. It was 1916. It was the whole start of our nationhood. It was the coming of actual an Irish independence. And the war, the people who went off in the First World War were not actually recognised. It is now we're only beginning to actually sort of see these people as actually sort of worthy of actually having some sort of, being given some sort of ceremony. So it is so much caught up with our own emerging identity as an Irish nation. We're very, very new. And I think it's very easy for European states to think that we're at a level where you have had your independence for years and years, for centuries. We're only emerging now. We're only beginning to see what is an Irish person. So you're talking about a European identity. Hell's bells, we're just struggling about who the hell are the Irish anyway, you know?
I have to absolutely disagree as chair, I shouldn't, but Italy was only formed in the
Germany was
19th
quite recent
century,
as well.
so was Germany.
Oh no, I know.
And actually, I would really say, read Paul Valery, read Robert Graves, and you will be part of European life and culture.
Well, then maybe it's something to do with actually being on the periphery. I don't know, but I'm just saying where the Irish people are at. I'm not saying whether your thing is right or my thing is right.
No,
I'm just actually
read,
saying
my
this
dear,
is.
you can read, and you're part of European civilization. Read the books. I'm going to ask our panel to respond before I bring anybody else in. Please go ahead, Philip.
Well, first of all, what hasn't been mentioned too much here is empire. You know, and I think we have to bring this to bear, as well as Peter's point about those who suffered in the underworld of laissez-faire capitalism within countries like in Europe. The imperial world, it gets very shocking when you put up against the discourse in 1914 about poor little Belgium. And of course we know the sufferings of the Belgians, and unquestionably horrific atrocities were committed. But under the aegis of King Leopold of Belgium, one of the most incredible and horrific and for a long time unacknowledged quasi-genocidal events, if not fully genocidal, happened with the rubber plantations in the centre of Africa. And indeed Roger Casement, of course, an intriguing Irishman, not that that matters in one sense, but he an intriguing man who participates in the whole struggle to out the Belgian Congo for what it is. So there's the issue of empire and the way indigenous peoples were treated all around the world, at a fairly shocking level. The second thing which connects very deeply into that, I speak by way as an enthusiastic European, okay? I am fully, enthusiastic about that. But where does Europe begin and where does it end? Let me have me think about this with you, right? The 10th Irish Division, one of the infantry divisions in the British Army, fought in several places. Fought at the Dardanelles, a horror story. 2,000 Irish soldiers killed. It then went to Macedonia and fought Bulgarians. Who remembers that? And then where did it go? Palestine. Under the aegis of Allenby, as the holy city of Jerusalem was taken for the British Empire and the Ottomans were expelled. So Irish soldiers were involved in attempting to take one Islamic holy city, and to a degree a Christian one as well, in history, Constantinople, and then involved in trying to, and actually taking another one. Now, what's that about? I was at a conference and speaking about Gallipoli down in Dublin, not so long ago, when the Turkish ambassador to Dublin was there. And he wept. He wept on the platform talking about, we should have been left to look after the Middle East because, these nations, these Christian nations would not, didn't understand, didn't deal with it properly, Palestine, the whole Palestinian issue and so on. Now, I'm not saying I endorse his lachrymose rhetoric, but nonetheless, can you see that in actual fact, as we in European empires divided up with a square rule and a bit of basic geometry, bits of the Middle East, we're now seeing many of them falling apart with disastrous consequences, in part because of that. And if you look at the Belfast Cenotaph, if you're here for Belfast for the first time, you might get down to the centre. Have a look at the Belfast Cenotaph. Opened in 1929. By the way, replacing a much earlier, much more human, small-scale one, which was at the corner of Chichester Street, and a citizens' venture. But that grand one that went up in 1929, who opened it? It was a ceremonial figure who opened it. Allenby. So our Belfast Cenotaph, the narrative is tied in to the narrative of what happened in the Middle East. Yeah? So, I endorse us talking about Europe and, trying to get rid of, if we possibly can, overtly nationalistic ceremonies. But we've got to think about that porous place, and at times rather challenging place to think about between Europe and the rest of the world. And our place as Irish people in it. We weren't just colonised, we were colonisers. Most of the men who were looking after India and various provinces of India, many of them had Irish ancestry. Okay, you may say Anglo-Irish, I'm not so sure. There were places in Cork and Limerick and Belfast and Dublin that were doing very well, thank you, and I went back. So, let's remember that. After the war, my final point, after the war, this is a disquieting thing for me. After the war, not everybody experienced that sense of repudiation of what had happened to them. Our relationship as human beings with suffering is a complex one. And sometimes a perverse and strange one. At a very flippant level, let me tell you, I have a friend who's a rock climber. Every time he goes up, he hits it. He's going to die at any minute. But the next Friday, he can't wait till he gets back up. We love suffering sometimes. It gives us some great highs. Now, that's a flippant version of it. But in actual fact, look at Germany, the way men came back to the Freikorps, which was, a solidarity group of men who had been in the trenches together and gained some kind of a experience out of that, a solidarity of having been in the war. And the disturbing thing for us, here in Ireland perhaps, or maybe you don't think it's disturbing, men came back from the British Army and joined the Irish Republican Army and were involved in the struggle for independence. Someone has argued now, if I may have got this wrong, but I think up to a third of the Irish Republican Army may well have back then. I might have got that stat wrong. Don't quote me on it. I might have got it wrong. But it's a fairly. Don't tweet it. But what I'm gesturing towards is a substantial number of key people in the Irish Republican Army. If you know your Irish history, people like Barry, Tom Barry, Tom Barry, and people of that nature were adult people like that. They were heavily involved, and it came with the learning they'd got from the trenches. And the other side of that, a substantial number of men came back here on the Unionist side. Don't tweet this, and they joined the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And in 1920, 2 years before the Royal Ulster Constabulary was founded, they joined the Special Constabulary, or were mentors to people who were in that constabulary. One particular veteran that I did interview talked about joining the police as angels and going up and down a particular road in Belfast taking pot shots at what he called chimney pots. I don't think he meant chimney pots. So that's the other disquieting thing. The disquieting thing is that we don't very often, men in particular perhaps, don't actually learn the lessons we think they ought to learn from that war, even though they went through grueling times in it. That complication, that psychological complication that I think as a man, for example, is inside the male spirit. I don't want to create generalizations too much about gender there, but I see it inside myself sometimes, that intrigue. Can I say just one last thing about this? One last thing I think is relevant. I don't want to be too depressing, but I was a teacher in the 1980s, and we're doing Wilfred Owen's poetry. Do you know this is all the poetry about how horrible war was? And my class, they thought war was horrible. It was terrible. But they really did. And loved the poems, and we felt the lesson had been learned. And then suddenly, Argentina invaded the Malvinas, the Falklands.
Yeah.
And they were coming in every day telling me about, they were watching what was going on. The British were giving it to the excitement of it.
Yeah.
Now, that taught me something too about the effectuality or non-effectuality of literature and the arts to deal with war. You know what I mean? And that's not to say literature doesn't have a key role. Of course it does. But in that case, it didn't do the job, I think, because they were pretty gung-ho. They're 14, 15, and the world maybe taught them a different lesson by now, but there you go. Sorry. I'm sorry if that's all a bit sober, Peter.
Thank you. Eric,
Yeah, on the romanticizing the period before the First World War, I was not talking so much because, of course, you're completely right. There was a lot of suffering, and it was only elite where this European culture building was going on. But we also had the Internationale. We should not forget that. So there was also a European movement built on a socialist level. And that also went to pieces. So I don't think it was so much about the real living circumstances. Point I was trying to make was that it wasn't an idea. It was a hope that went to pieces, you know. And that goes also for people who maybe had a very hard life, but who had maybe also this idea of progress in their heads, that everything was going better. Even if their life was miserable, but of course maybe their children, you know? And this whole idea of progress, I think, and of moral progress, I think that really went to pieces in the First World War. And then of course the Second World War made it even worse, but the rupture was then. That was the point I was trying to make. So.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes for questions.
Can I shortly react also to the...
sorry. Go ahead.
Although I'm absolutely not very well informed about the Irish history, but I think you're completely right. Of course, my context as a Dutch person is different. And I don't want to say... I think that you also... you can say a lot of things about the nation state. It created a lot of problems, but it's not the same thing as nationalism in its aggressive way. I think you can very well have a European identity, and in the same time have a national identity, it should not disturb each other. I think you can do the same thing.
What I think is that it's been taken out of context. Our actual sort of search for a national identity is not necessarily bad. It's making it very sort of rich for us because we're bringing in two different cultures here.
Yes.
You know, which will encompass both traditions. We can think on a European level, but at the same time, what we're actually doing at the moment is essential for us. You know.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, but I think they can go on absolutely together, and yes. I think it can even help when you're busy with yourself and your own identity to hear from others and how their identity was formed and
build on it. Absolutely,
that can help. And what you said, I don't know. I think that's a very difficult question, and maybe I think of course part of the whole debate. There are questions that have to be sorted out locally on a local level. Not everything can be done on the European level, but I think the exchange is vital. But doesn't mean that that you don't have to do your homework really in the intimacy of your own sphere.
Okay.
Peter,
yes.
had a hand up.
Yeah.
John.
I know you so well. Sorry about missing you. John.
It's unfortunate we've got less than 15 minutes to deal with 100 years of history and so on. It's a really rich conversation we're having. As many of you know in the room, I come from the Marxist-Lentilist wing of the Green movement. I'm a watermelon green. I essentially begin, and I'm delighted to hear that All Quiet on the Western Front was name-checked. And indeed, if you go on to Philip Bohr's, I don't know if it's your Twitter feed or your Facebook page, there's a wonderful Scottish author whose book you have, which I read recently as well. And all builds up to me that I'm a confirmed Marxist when I read about the First World War. A war is a gun with a working man at either end. That's the take-home lesson for me of that war. Yes, essentially. And we have, Peter mentioned the issue of, class, maybe, and you've mentioned the Internationale and so on. And it's an issue that I think, in the context of austerity that's been mentioned and the changes in European politics, that I think is even more relevant now we have to refight many of the battles, that, and in particular reference to the Second World War, where the welfare state, which still stands, and I speak as somebody who's engaged with folk who've been engaged in the flags protest and so on, a sense of their Britishness in Northern Ireland being diminished. I said to them, why can't you celebrate the NHS, our National Health Service, as an example of British identity, which is formed on the back of the deaths of millions of people in the Second World War. And it seems to me, and it's odd as a Green, because we often don't talk about this as Greens, many of us in the room be Green, of class. Class is not, it never has gone away. Neoliberalism is more rampant now than ever was before. And it seems to me that I would like to see more of the analysis of the First World War being based around class politics. Now, not because I'm a naive Marxist, although I'm not being a naive Marxist. I can do good things with a few drinks in you as well.
You definitely have to write an article for the head. Our next issue is on the comeback of Marxism.
Well, it has to be with a reference to climate change, a low carbon future, and away from often a naive view of what a post-capitalist society would be. But I think this issue of class, I think, relates to Philip's comments about empire and imperialism, and the fact that, in particular, in Ireland, we are overtly fond of assuming a victim status. We were colonised, we're the victims, and therefore we assume often, not always overtly, but we assume by osmosis a sense of superiority. I think there's some difficult questions that we have to answer, as Philip has raised. We did quite well out of the First World War. It wasn't the case that we were completely innocent of some of the things that happened after the war. So none of this, what I'm saying, is actually a question. It's more of a provocation in terms of the issues of class in particular. And I think the relation to what's happened in the European elections is in part a reflection of that. I think Peter's absolutely correct. Why is it that those countries who are suffering the most in some ways in the southern part of Europe voted left? With the exception, of course, I think the Greens held their vote fairly well on the island of Ireland and in the UK. A discernible shift to the right. And this whole context, to finish, I smell the whiff of the 1930s. There's a definite whiff of xenophobia, of racism, of nationalism, tied in now with this toxic element of the commemoration of war. So I'm quite fearful. And so what I'm interested in this weekend is what can we as Greens, who I see as a 21st century iteration of a progressive pan-European force in the world, what can we do in this context?
Okay, we have a few minutes
good
left.
question for tomorrow.
Good. Peter, go ahead.
This is following up from what Philip was saying. In 1912, there was a young lad who wanted to join the army. And he went up to the recruiting sergeant, and his voice was fairly broken. And the sergeant said, go away, little lad, you're no good. That was 1912, when the Balkans were fighting against the Turks, and this was involving Serbs and Albanians and Bosnians all fighting together on one side. 2 years later, that guy, Princet, belonged to a group called the Young Serbs. When the Archduke Ferdinand was visiting Sarajevo, and he decided that he was a man, that he wasn't a little boy at all, and that he could do something. And a group of them went up by the now famous bridge, and they had a gun, and the Archduke came up, and the car stopped. Now, if you're an Archduke in a country that doesn't like you very much, you can't stop. But he did. And they thought, this is now our moment, and they fired and the gun jammed. So they, oh God, and they thought, okay, we'll give. But then they thought, oh no, come on, let's have another go. So they came back to the gun, and the Archduke was still there. And they fired it, and it went. And it raises the question of whether, for humankind, there are some things that are almost beyond our, almost inevitable, actually, as if it was preordained that this was going to happen, that Churchill was going to be in power at the time of the Second World War, and lots of other things. Huge questions, but it does come back to the education system.
Yeah, I'm going to bring two more people in, yourself and yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I suppose I just wanted to touch on something that you said, Nuala, in relation to the global context and globalisation. I suppose for me, just going back to my university days about 15 years ago, the internet wasn't really part of what we were doing. And then when I left in 2000, it was we were in the midst of a global technological communication and cheap travel revolution. And over the next few years, I went backpacking in Australia, lived in New Zealand for a while, worked in the States. And for me, in 2014, I'm part of a new sort of emerging global community of 7.1 billion people. And I suppose it goes back to in terms of what are the sort of rules that sort of govern sort of behaviour of this sort of new, I suppose, global social media environment. And I suppose it goes back to the UNDHR, talking about the highest aspiration of people being freedom from fear and want, the idea of working towards a shared humanity, arbitrary right to privacy, and there's the UNDHR conflicting against, say, what's happening in social networks, and as well as sort of legacy issues in relation to the institutional environment and the behaviour of certain companies and corporations. And I think over the next few years, with the sort of explosion, especially in relation to social media, is that sort of tension between the global sort of view of the world and sort of behaving in terms of universalities, and sort of the old sort of local way of doing things. I think that tension is going to sort of grow more unless sort of leadership is shown in terms on a global level, sort of a recognition that we're moving towards this sort of new global community now.
Thank you. Yeah, one more. Brief question.
Yeah, just an observation. It wasn't just patriotic fervour that made people join the British Army in 1914. There was a lockout in Cork in 1907. There was a lockout in Dublin in 1913, and the working class just couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
If you were organised labour, you couldn't get a job. The British Army paid you twice the average industrial wage.
Yeah.
So that was
Very good.
Right, well, to the crown, to the half crown.
Well, my personal view is that if they had brought in the NHS in 1922 instead of 1945, we would never have left the mothership. So that's just...
Nuala Hearn wasn't back to the Commonwealth.
That's not what I said.
No. That was what I tweeted.
A brief comment from yourself. Now,
well, I think I would like to hear a lot more, because I think that's what it's about, to really listen to each other's stories, and also personal stories, what it meant, what everything, what Europe is meaning to you or is not meaning to you. And as you know, the Netherlands were neutral during the First World War, so we were sort of outside. So in a way, it's easy for me. I have no grandfathers or great-grandfathers who were killed or traumatized in the First World War. Second World War is another story, of course. But Benoit, we talked about, he also published an article in our last issue on the World War. And we talk a lot about these things, because there were a lot of Belgians. There was an electronic fence between... the Germans put up an electronic fence between Belgium and the Netherlands, because a lot of Belgian people were fleeing to the Netherlands, and the Germans didn't want to. And also they wanted to prevent soldiers to go and join their army through the Netherlands. And a lot of people died in this fence because they were not familiar with electricity it was really terrible. And in the Netherlands, you had a lot of Belgian refugees, but all these stories, also in the Netherlands, they're not very well known. Nobody knows this. So I think and on populism, the question raised, I think it's really a very huge question. I don't think we're on the 30s. I interpret it a little bit different. I think on the one hand, the right-wing populism is undermining democracy, but on the same time, and I say it in a little provocative way, it is democracy. And it is, those people have a voice, and they are not well represented now in our political system. So it is a good sign that they are there and they're forming political parties. So, of course, it raises a lot of other questions, but it has more sides to it. So I don't think we're back in the 30s. No.
Just a couple of wee things. First of all, yeah, in war, some people get very wealthy and some people go to the wall.
Yeah.
And in Ireland, farmers, particularly farmers with a lot of land, did very, very well indeed and were resented for it. And it was what resented also that their sons didn't tend to go to the war either. And one of the things that a lot of people got wealthy on was horses. There were something like 34,000 horses in County Down alone. There's 6 counties in Northern Ireland. 34,000 horses alone in an era when the horse was everything. And many of those horses ended up in the Western Front and dead. Were the purple poppy, if you were a poppy. There's a purple poppy for the animals that died. There's an environmental issue. There is an issue about respect for creature life as well as human life. A lot of people got really quite wealthy from the war, not just from the horses, but just that's the way it was. At the other end of the scale, inflation tore through the Irish economy, as it did the British economy. Prices went up sometimes 250% in the course of the war, and a lot of people were struggling very, very, very much indeed because of that. The final thing I want to do is just give you a wee anecdote about Ireland's best contribution to the First World War, and that is sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss, which was found in Irish bogs. There were huge campaigns to mobilise children, often brought about by women, mostly gentrified women, to actually gather in sphagnum moss, because sphagnum moss in an era without antibiotics had a strong antiseptic quality. I can't give you a stat, but literally tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of sphagnum moss bandages were sent from Ireland in order to be put on the wounds of those who died and those who survived. And I think that is a rather fine little poem. Commemoration. I would like to see a sphagnum moss. I'd like to see a sprig of sphagnum moss as our new kind of, for Ireland anyway, and we can all share it. We find emblems that say something about healing rather than combat.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. The evening is not over yet, and we'll hear more about that. But I just want one final word to me. I really don't feel there's any contradiction between our own loyalties to our own communities and our small island and the greater European family that we belong to. And I think we've heard really about that tonight in a very, very powerful way. We can go wider than that, but for tonight, I think it's enough to know that we are Irish, British or Republicans, and we are Europeans as well, and that there really is. And I don't share your fears. I think that the latest elections has shown that it's a protest against the elites. There's an awful lot of grandiosity out there in Brussels. I really, really was very sick of it when I was out there myself. And they need a wake-up call, and they have gotten it, I hope. So, we need to build a better Europe. We need to build a Europe that, Europeans can understand and be part of. and we're not doing that yet. So I think I'd like to thank our two Europeans here tonight for being here.
This has been a Join the Cool production for the Green Foundation Ireland. To find out more, visit their website greenfoundationireland.ie.